Imagine that you're live on national TV. You've got a panel of people waiting to corner you, cameras rolling, lights blazing, and you decide you're done playing along. That's exactly what Senator John Fetterman just did. On The View, the host tried to trap him into blaming Republicans for the shutdown, but instead, Fetterman looked straight into the camera and said, "My party crossed a line," and in that single moment, everything changed. The Democratic establishment froze. The audience gasped. And millions watching realized maybe, just maybe, one of their own had finally had enough. Because what happened next wasn't just about Fetterman, it exposed a deep fracture running right through the heart of the Democratic Party. A fracture that's been building for years, hidden behind talking points and party discipline, suddenly ripped wide open on live television for everyone to see. Let me walk you through exactly how this moment exploded and why it could reshape American politics heading into the next election cycle. Sunny Hostin, one of the hosts, has her talking points ready. She's been watching the polls. She knows Democrats have been gaining ground, blaming Republicans for the shutdown. The narrative has been set. Republicans are holding the government hostage. Democrats are fighting for the people. And then she asks Fetterman the question she thinks will seal the deal. She presses him, "Why give in now? Why not keep the pressure on Republicans when the polls are on your side?" But Fetterman doesn't take the bait. Instead, he pauses and says something nobody in that studio expected to hear from a sitting Democratic senator. He says his party crossed a line. He talks about the millions of Americans whose food assistance was about to disappear. He talks about military families going weeks without paychecks. He talks about air travel becoming unsafe because the people keeping our skies secure weren't getting paid. And then he says the part that really landed, that was a red line for me that I can't cross as a Democrat. Let that sink in for a moment. He didn't say Republicans crossed a line. He didn't say the system failed us. He said my party crossed a line. He took ownership. He broke rank, and he put principle over party loyalty. You could see it in Sunny's face. She wasn't expecting that. The audience wasn't expecting it. And judging by the social media explosion that followed, the entire political establishment wasn't expecting it either, because in modern politics, you just don't do that. You don't criticize your own side in enemy territory. You don't hand the opposition a soundbite. You don't risk your career for the sake of honesty. Except Fetterman just did. And that wasn't just a soundbite, it was a declaration of independence. It was a signal that something fundamental had shifted, not just in Fetterman himself, but in the very ground beneath the Democratic Party's feet. Because if a sitting senator elected on the Democratic ticket in a battleground state like Pennsylvania can stand up and say we've gone too far, then the question becomes, how many others are thinking the same thing but staying silent? Let's zoom out for a second. What exactly did Fetterman mean by cross the line? Because this wasn't about some abstract political disagreement over tax rates or trade policy. This was visceral. This was about real people facing real consequences. And Fetterman, who spent time working with communities that don't make headlines, who's seen what happens when government assistance disappears overnight, wasn't willing to play games with people's lives just to score political points. He mentioned the SNAP benefits. Those are the food stamps that help feed families who are already stretched thin. Imagine being a grandmother trying to buy groceries for your grandkids, only to find out the assistance you've relied on is suddenly gone because politicians in Washington decided it was more important to win a PR battle than to keep people fed. Or imagine being a soldier deployed overseas, serving your country, and learning your spouse back home doesn't know how they're going to pay the mortgage this month because your paycheck got caught in a political standoff. That's what Fetterman was talking about. And that's why his words carried so much weight. Because he wasn't speaking in abstractions or polling data. He was speaking as someone who understood, maybe from his own experiences with hardship, maybe from the years he spent as a small-town mayor in Pennsylvania, that politics isn't a game when real people are on the line. But here's where it gets even more interesting. If you think this was just one man having a spontaneous moment of conscience, you'd be missing the bigger picture. Because the pressure building behind the scenes had been mounting for weeks, and what Fetterman did on The View was really the final crack in a dam that had been straining under the weight of a party at war with itself. Let me explain what I mean. The government shutdown that Fetterman was talking about, it didn't just happen by accident. It was the result of a deliberate strategy by Democratic leadership to force Republicans into a corner. The idea was simple. Refuse to negotiate, let the shutdown drag on, let the pain build, and then watch as public opinion turns against the GOP. And for a while, it seemed to be working. The polls showed most Americans, somewhere in the range of 55 to 65%, were blaming Republicans for the mess. Democratic strategists were giddy. Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, thought he'd finally found the leverage he needed. But then something unexpected happened. 8 Democrats, Fetterman among them, broke ranks. They voted with Republicans to reopen the government, not because they agreed with everything the GOP wanted, not because they were switching teams, but because they looked at what was happening to federal workers, to families depending on benefits, to essential services hanging by a thread, and they said, enough, this has to stop. And the moment they did that, the Democratic establishment erupted. Progressive leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, and others on the far left accused the moderates of caving. They called it a betrayal. They said it was pathetic, a surrender, a catastrophic mistake. Governor Gavin Newsom, who many see as a future presidential candidate, went public with his frustration, calling the decision weak. Even Marjorie Taylor Greene, the controversial Republican congresswoman, criticized the GOP for letting it happen, which somehow got twisted into Democrats celebrating her as if she were on their side. It was chaos. And at the center of all this chaos stood John Fetterman, calm and unflinching, saying, I don't need a lecture from people who represent deep blue districts where they never have to face real political consequences. I represent Pennsylvania. I represent steel towns and coal communities and working families who don't care about your ideological purity tests. They care about whether they can put food on the table and keep the lights on. Now, you might be wondering, who is this guy, really? Because just a few years ago, Fetterman was barely on the national radar. And when he did break through, a lot of people weren't sure what to make of him. He looked different. He talked different. He didn't fit the polished, consultant-approved mold of a modern politician. And then he had a stroke. A serious one. The kind that derails careers and changes lives forever. But instead of quietly fading away, Fetterman came back. And not just came back different. Came back with a clarity that only someone who's faced death and depression and the absolute bottom can really have. He talks openly about lying in bed for months, unable to move, his family unable to reach him emotionally. He talks about the darkest thoughts a person can have. And he talks about clawing his way out of that pit, not because he wanted to be a senator, but because he realized he still had something to give. That's the man who walked onto The View show. That's the man who refused to play along with the script. Because when you've been that close to losing everything, you stop caring about protecting your political career. You start caring about something bigger. And that authenticity, that's exactly what made him dangerous to his own side. Because the moment Fetterman spoke his truth on live television, he exposed something the Democratic Party has been trying to hide. They're not united. They're not the disciplined, coalition-driven machine they present to the public. They're fractured deeply. Between the old guard moderates who still believe in pragmatic compromise and the new wave of progressives who see compromise as betrayal, between working-class roots and elite coastal priorities, between those who think winning elections means listening to voters and those who think it means lecturing them. And when you crack that facade on national TV, when you let the American people see the infighting and the cynicism and the willingness to hurt ordinary people for political gain, you can't just put the mask back on and pretend everything's fine. The media certainly tried. CNN panels scrambled to make sense of what happened. You had pundits talking over each other, some trying to defend the shutdown strategy, others quietly admitting that maybe, just maybe, Fetterman had a point. One notable moment came when Scott Jennings, a Republican commentator on CNN, calmly dismantled the Democratic talking points by pointing out a simple fact. Republicans had voted over a dozen times to fund the very programs Democrats were now claiming Republicans wanted to cut. Democrats had voted against those same bills more than a dozen times. So who exactly was playing politics with people's lives? The silence that followed that question was deafening. And that's the thing about truth when it slips through live television. when someone says out loud what everyone knows but nobody's supposed to admit, it spreads faster than any amount of spin can contain. Social media lit up. Clips of Fetterman's comments went viral, shared not just by conservatives who saw it as vindication, but by independents and even Democrats who were tired of the games, tired of the hypocrisy, tired of being told that loyalty to the party mattered more than doing the right thing. The View's attempt to corner Fetterman backfired spectacularly. Instead of getting him to fall in line, they gave him a platform to speak directly to millions of Americans who were hungry to just tell the truth. And in doing so, they accidentally revealed the real story. The Democratic Party is eating itself from the inside out, and the people noticing aren't just Republicans, they're people like Fetterman. People who used to believe... Now, here's where it gets more complicated, because Fetterman isn't just one senator breaking ranks. He represents something much bigger, a tension that's been tearing the Democratic Party apart for years now, but that most people don't fully see, because it plays out behind closed doors, in private meetings, in whispered conversations between votes. Think about it this way. The Democratic Party used to be the party of the working class, union workers, factory towns, people who got their hands dirty and their paychecks by the hour. That was the core, that was the identity. But somewhere along the way, and you can debate exactly when or how that identity started to shift, the party became more focused on cultural issues, on identity politics, on appealing to college-educated urban voters who care deeply about progressive causes, but who, frankly, don't have much in common with the people who used to be the party's base. And guys like Fetterman, they're caught in the middle, because he still is that working-class Democrat. He grew up in a blue-collar family. He served as mayor of Braddock, a struggling steel town in Pennsylvania that most politicians wouldn't visit unless there was a photo op. He knows what it's like when the factory closes and doesn't reopen. He knows what it's like when people are just trying to survive, not trying to win a culture war. But the modern Democratic Party, or at least the loudest voices in it, doesn't have much patience for that worldview anymore. They want purity. They want everyone on board with every progressive position, no questions asked, no dissent allowed. And if you step out of line, if you dare to say that maybe, just maybe, shutting down the government and hurting millions of people isn't the right move, well, then they'll tell you're a traitor, that you're weak and that you're not a real Democrat. That's the dilemma Fetterman faces. And it's the same dilemma facing every moderate Democrat in a competitive district or state. Do you stand for what you actually believe is right, knowing it might cost you your career? Or do you fall in line, keep your head down, and hope the party machine protects you when re-election comes around? Fetterman made his choice. And the blowback was immediate. But he wasn't the only one feeling the heat. Because while Fetterman was making headlines for his honesty, Chuck Schumer, the man who's supposed to be leading Senate Democrats, was quietly drowning. And most Americans had no idea just how bad things had gotten for him. Here's what the data showed. Schumer's approval ratings among Democrats nationwide had cratered. We're talking about numbers in the low 40s, maybe even dipping into the 30s, depending on which poll you looked at. And here's the kicker. His net favorability, the difference between people who like him and people who don't, was actually negative among his own party members. Let me say that again. The Democratic leader in the Senate was underwater with Democrats. That doesn't happen unless something has gone seriously wrong. And it wasn't just the polls. Inside the party, the knives were out. Progressive representatives and activists were openly calling for Schumer to step down. They said he was ineffective. They said he was too willing to compromise with Republicans. They said he wasn't fighting hard enough against Trump's agenda. Even some moderates were quietly agreeing, though for different reasons they thought Schumer's refusal to negotiate during the shutdown was political malpractice, and they blamed him for putting them in an impossible position. There were even rumors that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the young progressive congresswoman from New York, who's become one of the most recognizable faces in the Democratic Party, was considering a primary challenge against Schumer when his seat came up for re-election, and the polling suggested she might actually have a shot. Among New York Democrats, her favorability was running somewhere between 15 and 20 points higher than Schumer's. That's a huge gap. That's the kind of gap that ends careers. So Schumer was facing a rebellion on both flanks. Progressives thought he wasn't radical enough. Moderates thought he was too radical. And in the middle of all this chaos, he made the decision to keep the government shut down, betting that he could break the Republicans before his own party broke him. He lost that bet. And when those 8 Democrats, including Fetterman, voted to reopen the government, it wasn't just a policy defeat for Schumer. It was a public humiliation, because it showed that he couldn't even keep his own caucus in line. It showed that when push came to shove, there were senators who cared more about their constituents than they did about his strategy. It showed weakness. And in politics, once that weakness is exposed, it's almost impossible to recover. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so Schumer's in trouble, Fetterman's speaking out, the party's divided, but why does any of this matter to me? What does this have to do with my life? And that's a fair question, so let me connect the dots. This isn't just about politics. It's about something much deeper. It's about whether we still have leaders in either party who are willing to tell the truth even when it's inconvenient, who are willing to stand on principle even when it costs them something, who actually mean it when they say they're serving the people instead of themselves. And Fetterman's journey, the reason his story resonates so deeply, is that he's already lost everything once. He's already been to the bottom, and that gives him a freedom that most politicians don't have. Think about what he's been through, the stroke he had, the months of recovery where he couldn't speak clearly, couldn't process information the way he used to, couldn't even get out of bed some days, the depression that followed, and he's been brutally honest about this, where he seriously considered ending his own life because he couldn't see a way forward. The humiliation of that debate performance during his Senate campaign, where everyone watching could see he was still struggling, where his opponents used his medical condition against him, where half the country wrote him off as finished. But he didn't quit. He kept going. He got help. He fought through the darkness. And somewhere in that process, something crystallized for him. He realized that if he was going to be in public service, if he was going to put himself and his family through the grind of politics, it was going to be on his terms. It was going to be authentic. It was going to mean something. That's the man who stood up on The View and said, "My party crossed a line." That's not someone reading from a script or calculating political angles. That's someone who's been through hell and came out the other side with his integrity intact. And you can hear it in his voice. You can see it in his eyes. He's not playing a role anymore. He's just being himself. And here's what's remarkable. That authenticity is what Americans are desperate for. Because we're tired, aren't we? Tired of being lied to. Tired of watching politicians say one thing in public and do another in private. Tired of being treated like we're too dumb to notice the contradictions and the cynicism and the endless games. Fetterman's message, whether he fully realizes it or not, is basically this: country over party, people over politics, truth over spin. And that message doesn't belong to Democrats or Republicans. It belongs to anyone who's fed up with the way things are. That's why you saw something extraordinary happen after his View appearance. Republicans praised him, not because they agree with him on everything they don't, but because they recognize something genuine. Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator from South Carolina, went on national television and said Fetterman might be one of the few Democrats who could actually survive in this political environment because people trust him. He said Fetterman has a hell of a story to tell, and voters respond to authenticity even when they don't agree on every issue. And he's right, because at the end of the day, what most Americans want isn't ideological purity, it's competence, it's honesty. It's someone who will look them in the eye and shoot straight instead of spinning them. Fetterman gave people that, and the establishment on both sides honestly doesn't quite know what to do with him. So what happens next? That's the question everyone's asking now. Does Fetterman leave the Democratic Party entirely? Some people think he should. There are already Republicans quietly reaching out, suggesting he'd be welcome if he wanted to switch teams. Lindsey Graham basically said as much. Laura Trump, the president's daughter-in-law, has talked publicly about her private conversations with Fetterman, saying he has more in common with Trump's working-class populism than he does with the modern Democratic Party. And honestly, she might not be wrong, because if you look at Fetterman's actual positions, strong support for Israel, skepticism of endless progressive demands, willingness to work across the aisle, focus on kitchen table issues over culture war fights, he really doesn't fit neatly into today's Democratic coalition. He's a throwback, a relic of a time when Democrats could win in places like Pennsylvania by actually caring about the people who live there, not by lecturing them about what they should believe. But here's the thing. Fetterman hasn't switched parties, and I don't think he's going to, at least not in the immediate future, because despite everything, despite the criticism, despite the pressure, despite how uncomfortable his own party makes him, he still believes the Democratic Party should be the party of working people. He still believes it can be that party again, if enough people are willing to fight for it. Whether he's right about that, time will tell. But what we do know is this. His stand has already changed the conversation. It's given cover to other moderate Democrats who've been quietly thinking the same things but were afraid to say them out loud. It's forced Democratic leadership to confront the reality that their hardline strategy isn't working. And it's reminded millions of Americans, particularly older Americans, who remember when politics wasn't quite this tribal, quite this vicious, that there are still people in Washington who haven't completely lost their way. The fallout from this moment is still unfolding. Schumer's position looks shakier by the day. The progressive wing is furious, convinced they had Republicans on the ropes and moderates snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. The moderate wing is exhausted, tired of being dragged into positions they don't believe in just to satisfy the activist base. And meanwhile, Republicans are watching all of this with barely concealed glee, knowing that a divided opposition makes their jobs much, much easier. But here's what nobody's really talking about, and it's the most important part. This isn't just about Democrats. The same fault lines exist on the Republican side, too. The same tension between pragmatists and purists. The same struggle between people who want to govern and people who want to make statements. The same question of whether party loyalty matters more than principle. Fetterman's moment on The View mattered because it cut through all of that. It reminded us that before we're Democrats or Republicans, we're Americans. And the country works better when we have leaders who remember that. So here's where we are. John Fetterman refused to play the game, told the truth, and in doing so exposed just how broken our political system has become. Not because he intended to make some grand statement, I don't think he did, but because he's reached a point in his life where he simply can't stomach the dishonesty anymore. And that's not a partisan thing. That's a human thing. The question now is whether his example inspires others. Whether more senators and representatives on both sides decide that enough is enough, that they'd rather stand for something real than keep playing the partisan games that are tearing the country apart. Whether voters reward that kind of courage or punish it, I'd like to believe we reward it. I'd like to believe that most Americans, regardless of their political affiliation, are hungry for leaders who